know that this has been going on for 60 years at least, arguably a century, and that the particular occupation has been going on for 40 some years, and the peace process, the diplomatic process, has been going on for some 21 years. So let's start with the last phase, so we won't have a history 101. I'm sure a lot of you knows this history as much as I do, maybe perhaps better. The party started negotiations 20 years ago when I came to Princeton, and there were three problematic aspects to it when it first. One is that it was clear that the parties, the immediate parties to the conflict, the Palestinians and the Israelis, were not convinced. The Israelis were not convinced of the limits of their victory, and the Palestinians were not convinced by the extent of their defeat. The Israelis thought it was the end of the Cold War, that the Arabs were divided and discredited after the second Gulf War, 1991, if you remember the invasion of Iraq and so forth, liberation of Kuwait, and the weakening of the PLO at the time, because it sided with Iraq against the military intervention and so forth. The Israelis thought that this was not the time to sign on a final agreement because they still have much more to gain, because their victory was not totally translated in reality. The Palestinians believed that they were so weak, the balance of power was so unfavorable to them, the PLO was so isolated, there was so little on the table for them to grab, that they didn't believe this was the time for them to sign on to it. So what happens is that the process, the diplomatic process, as far as the Palestinian and Israelis are concerned, became the continuation of conflict through diplomatic means. With Israel being more powerful, the occupying force on the ground, it was able to translate that logic in a far more concrete way than the Palestinians. The Palestinians could make statements, could make noise, and at one point some of the more opposing to the diplomatic process, Hamas and so on and so forth, start carrying more aggressive actions and so on and so forth. But the both parties, not convinced that this was their time, started using the process as a way to advance their positions. Which takes me to the second point. The transitionality of the diplomatic process. The fact that, unlike the process with Egypt in 1979, where the parties agreed to the end game, and then the transition was a question of implementation rather than negotiations, the diplomatic process between Israelis and Palestinians was negotiate in stages, implement in phases, and the implementation and the negotiations is dependent on the implementation as decided by the parties, and in this case, the stronger party was Israel. Hence, 7 interim peace agreements were signed, each one conditional on the other, in the end leading to not so much. In fact, this process was supposed to be 5 years, 1993 to 1998. By the time we hit 1998, when this whole thing was supposed to end, meaning 3 years plus 2 years of final negotiations and then signed the end of the conflict, by 1998, Israel has redeployed from merely 18% of the West Bank and 60% of Gaza. Meaning 5 years later, the fact that the process was in such transition all the time and implementation was difficult because the parties did not really believe what they were doing was the end game, and because the negotiations on the second stage was dependent on the implementation of the earlier stage, we went on not just 5 years. This process went on arguably since 1991, if you will, from 1993 onwards until today, 2 decades, leading to more of the same procrastination, stagnation, and so on and so forth. Which takes me to the third point. Parties not convinced transitional period perpetuates the lack of confidence between them, and the sponsor of those talks, in this case, the successive US administrations, Washington was hardly an honest broker. And for the simple fact, and it's a fact, it's not fiction, it's not an opinion, it's the declared reality that the United States and Israel are the 2 closest allies. And the fact that the process would be sponsored, would be brokered by one of the parties' most precious, most intimate, most close ally, made it even harder for 2 parties that don't have confidence in a process that is transitional to come to terms on anything that is final. That's the 2 decades. Where did that bring us? Right before the Arab Spring, the Arab Revolution, any which way you'd like to call it, started, already the failure of this process was clear, that this was going nowhere. And Palestinians and Israelis, for all practical purposes, have stopped talking 2 years ago. It happened to be that it was just when the Bush administration was leaving and the new administration was leaving. Three things happened. I like, by the way, Trinities. So, you know, God, the Son, the Holy Spirit, God, the Prophet, the Quran, and so on. Where we can always do Moses and getting lost in the 10 Commandments in Sinai, but that's the different part. Anyway, I like always Trinities. So we had 3 problems when we ended up. One is the radicalization of the Israeli society. To make a long story short, Israel hadn't seen such radical government, such radical electorate, such radical coalition government since its inception in 1948. Israel's political spectrum in general moved from so-called left to center right to the right. People in the Labour Party until 3-4 years ago couldn't imagine that they would end up third in the Israeli elections. The fact that someone like Avigdor Lieberman would become a foreign minister of Israel was something that is, you know, I mean, just impossible for Israelis to imagine. The fact he would become kingmaker, really impossible to imagine. The fact that the settler community becomes so indispensable for the success of the Likud party. The fact that you will have 16 parliament members in Israel, 16 out of 120 settlers living, according to national law, as illegal settlers in occupied territories. Indeed, arguably 4 ministers, including the foreign minister and the finance minister, living in settlements. That radicalization in Israel became, of course, more problematic. This was no longer for those who were enamored by Yitzhak Rabin, the former, the deceased. There's no more Yitzhak Rabins in Israel. If anyone dreamt that Yitzhak Rabin would have been the modern day, well, it's not even so modern day, because it was exactly the same time when de Klerk and Mandela made their deal, if you remember. And in fact, Mandela won in the same week that Rabin signed Oslo II. Same week in 1994, imagine. But in any case, whoever imagined or hoped that Yitzhak Rabin would become the de Klerk of Israel-Palestine, of course, would have been disappointed, especially with his assassination by an Israeli radical. But certainly in today's Israeli government, Israeli spectrum, there is no Yitzhak Rabin to be found. On the Palestinian side, there was similar process of radicalization going on. And here, by the way, if you notice from the way I'm speaking here, I'm not attaching any legitimization to a political or sociological construct. I'm not saying this is good, this is bad, this is wonderful. At last they're awakened. No legitimization attached to what I'm saying. Just trying to build the construct, the power construct, if you will, of what is that. So a similar process of radicalization took place in Palestine. Of course, for most of you all of you know, this culminated in the Hamas victory in 2006, 2005, 2006, and to them taking over the majority of the seats in parliament, and for them to go form a government that, of course, would not see the light after a few weeks, months. It was boycotted, sanctioned. Then there was some called coup d'etat, some called division, and so on and so forth between Gaza and the West Bank. You all know the history after that. Although the PLO, Fatah, and Abbas as a president remained to be the party to engage the international community within Palestine, a radicalization of the Palestinian political spectrum saw it that, in fact, Abbas no longer spoke for the Palestinians, that Fayyad, his prime minister, who had one seat in the Palestinian Legislative Council of 128, could not represent the Palestinian people's aspiration in the future as a prime minister that for most of them believed he was imposed by the United States and the Quartet. The Palestinians have gone through similar process of radicalization. Of course, it's also meant that the broker, after 20 years, has failed. And so many in the region, and notably in Israel-Palestine, felt that this broker cannot be trusted. This broker is not capable, is not willing, and is not an honest broker. The recent changes in the Middle East, in the Arab world, the revolution in Egypt and in Tunisia, the revolts in Syria, and so on and so forth, have taken this few steps further. How? One, in the immediate run, again, three processes that are taking place. One, the Palestinians feel that those very same processes that they themselves inspired through their first uprising and through their second uprising have now swept through the Arab region. That what is going on in the Arab world today is in fact the Palestinization of the Arab political process. So they are ever more assured that perhaps the future looks far brighter than the past, on the long term. On the short term, President Abbas lost his most valuable ally, President Mubarak of Egypt. Both processes, the immediate, what happened to Abbas, and the long term, what happened to the imagination of the Palestinian people, have led to a certain regrouping, if you will. They went and signed a deal, another deal of reconciliation in May in Cairo, both Hamas and Fatah. Eventually, Abbas went to the United Nations last week. Was it last week? 10 days ago? The logic of the bilateral relations de facto has failed. The Palestinians have regrouped in one form or another with far higher expectations than ever before. And if anyone thought there was radicalization going on, now it's radicalization on speed. And steroid. Because now it has imagination. It's not an act of desperation. It's actually an radicalization, and if I may, I will use radicalization here not just in the sense of extremism. I will use radicalization not in the sense of horizontal movement towards more radical right or more radical left. I mean in a more in-depth radicalization in the sense of anchoring in back to the principles of whatever the Palestinian revolution is, wherever the Palestinian principles are. So it's not moving to the right or the left, but rather really the Palestinian national movement in both its Islamist and its nationalist trends, holding closer, more tight, invoking their original language of liberation, of universal rights, and so on and so forth. The words that we heard from President Abbas for the first time at the United Nations. Israel went through again similar process. I was amazed. Again, in the Middle East, you're always shocked, but hardly ever surprised. But I was shocked, but not surprised to hear here in New York when Defense Minister Barak visited. He gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal saying, "Well, now that there is the Arab Spring slash democratization in the Arab world, we need $10 billion from the United States." If you were sitting in Israel, you would say, "Wait a minute, what the heck is going on here? Where is this going? Is this the right thing?" Those who were lecturing and saying you cannot do peace with the Arabs because they are the mentality, the exceptionalism, and so on and so forth. You need to democratize the Arab world in order to talk to the Arab world, and without democracy. If you remember, we're all here old enough to remember when President Bush was citing Anatol Sharansky, the Jewish immigrant to Israel who wrote a book about democracy in the Arab world and why it's important, and that inspired George Bush to say, look, the democratic agenda is more important than anything else, attach it to the US national security, and so on. Suddenly, now that the Arab world started moving and more room for democratization, they panicked in Israel. If you thought they panicked in Washington, you haven't been to Tel Aviv. They panicked. They didn't know where this was going. In fact, if you are, or they are, we are a bit more transparent and honest with ourselves, we will know that anyone who looked at the polls in the Arab world the last 60 years knows that democracy is not friendly to Israel in the Arab world. Democracy is not friendly to the United States in the Arab world. And to nuance this, I will also make the differentiation not only between extremism and radicalism, I will make the distinction between Washington and the United States. That democratization in the Arab world won't be friendly to Washington, meaning to American policy in the Middle East, or to Arabs' perception of what American policy in the Middle East has been. Democratization in Israel would not be friendly to Israel. Democratization in the Arab world won't be friendly to Israel, it won't be friendly to the United States. But Israel retrenched even further than it did before. The fact that you would contemplate signing a deal with the Palestinians, withdrawing from the 1967 territories, withdrawing from the Jordan River, and allowing the Palestinian state to be sovereign, viable, completely sovereign. You're not going to find an Israeli official who was going to sign on this last year. And had little to do with Annapolis, and had little to do with Obama promising last September from the United Nations podium that in 1 year we're going to have a peace deal and so on and so forth. The reality on the ground is as such, is that the same process that we witnessed in the early 90s, we witness it today, except that today is even, as I said, it's actually one story. That the Israelis believe this is not the time, the Palestinians believe this is not the time because of the changing reality in the region. Third point, and I'll try to think about that, is what has happened in the process on the ground. What has happened in the process on the ground, because of all these failures and because of all these processes, was the expansion of Jewish settlements in the occupied area, notably West Bank and East Jerusalem. When the process started in 1991 in Madrid, there were 75,000 settlers in the West Bank. In 1993, there were 95. In 1996, there were 145. In 2000, there were 300. And we're still talking outside Jerusalem, outside East Jerusalem, which is not recognized, including by the United States, as the government. That expansion of settlements across some 200 settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem has made the reality on the ground as such that separation of Palestinians and Israelis in two separate, contiguous states on anything that resembles the line of 1967 is becoming more and more of an improbability. Meaning, even if you have the goodwill, even if things change in the Middle East to the right, in the right direction, and even if you have the right big clerk and the right Mandela and whatever you want to do to two states or any which states, confederation, whichever way, the idea of separating Palestinians and Israelis on the lines of 1967 borders has in fact become, I think, not only problematic, more or less impossible to do without serious ethnic cleansing. And a real one. Ethnic cleansing might give it a certain moral or a certain, it's actually a legal meaning. What I mean is you can have to transfer a huge amount of people, which I don't think there is the will or the capacity. And as I said earlier, with 16 parliament members and Israel settlers, 4 ministers, the idea that you can actually think of evacuating settlements is impossible. The idea that you would leave them there as Palestinian citizens is improbable. The idea, as I mentioned throughout the last few minutes, of the political process and the radicalization and so on and so forth in both Israel and Palestine, and the failure of the US and the international community to act, is all making it this ever more difficult. Does it mean it's bad news? Is it doomed? Always good news, like democracy in the Arab world, are pregnant with bad news, hence more retrenchments and more hardening of positions in Israel and Palestine. To be honest with you, I personally don't see a way out anytime soon. I don't. I don't see this thing going towards a resolution anytime soon. And I do think that it is problematic to say the least. However, what's going on in the region in general is even more unpredictable. But I think they're related. If the overall process in the region continues to go in the right way, and that's a subject to another of our gathering, then I think eventually it will make things easier for us in Israel. I believe so. If they don't go the right way, meaning there will be more problematic changes, meaning as we're seeing in Syria today, for example, or as we're seeing in Yemen today, or as we're seeing even in Libya, or the procrastination in Egypt, or whichever results are going to lead in the next elections, all of those, I think, will have major effect on the long term, depending what the scenario is and what goes on in Israel-Palestine. For the time being, I think Israel and Palestine are going to need, by those peace-loving people out there, all the help they can in order to, bring out, if you will, I don't know, their humanity, their peace-loving, their whichever words you like to choose are not political for me. But anyway, I think they're going to need all the help and all the miracles that are possible. On that not so positive note, I will end. Thank you.